And certainly for the first couple of decades after 2000, Chinese investments, trade and investments in the region were very much limited to economic activity. They did not get involved in anything political, and in some respects, they benefited from the security umbrella that the United States provided. Now, that has started to change. And in the last decade, what you have seen is that, as I've mentioned, this growing rivalry between the United States and China, with Washington putting pressure on its allies and partners to not work with Chinese firms or flagging up security risks. In the case of Israel, it was very clear. We have to pull out with the Chinese because our primary partner is and ally is the United States. But you have also seen it in the Gulf. And we've seen that with the UAE firm G42, which is interested in high tech stuff, cybersecurity issues, AI, big data. They signed a couple of contracts with various Chinese firms, and in the last few years, you've seen America, the U.S. administration and officials, making clear their concern about that.
So good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I'm Dr. Shubhra Chaudhary and this is Middle East Insights platform. And thankfully, we are back on Twitter. So today we are going to talk about what is the role of China in the Gulf region. And it's going to be a very, very conversation-based podcast, very interesting. And I am at a personal level very, very privileged today because Dr. Guy Burton, I've been following him for almost like 3 years now. And when his book came on China and Middle East, that was something which left a very lasting impression on my mind because as like someone wrote about it, finally, kind of. So, and over the period of time, his growth and his journeys have really been very enticing for someone who looks up to him. So in short, I will try to explain who he is to our audience. There's a lot. But I'll start from that. He was acting director, research fellow at Center for Development Studies at Birzeit University, Ramallah. He was a politics lecturer at University of Kurdistan in Erbil. He was a fellow at American Political Science Association. He was an assistant professor at University of Nottingham, Malaysia campus. He was also an assistant professor at Mohammed bin Rashid School of Government in Dubai. He was a visiting professor at LSE Middle East Center. I want you to think about it in terms of geography. Just imagine how much of globetrotting is happening here. It is very, very, envious to be. And then he was adjunct professor at Brussels School of Governance. He was a fellow of Sectarianism Proxies and Desectarianism Project at Lancaster University. And apart from that, as it is mentioned in a poster, he has also written 2 books. The first one is China and the Middle East Conflicts. And then the second one is The Rising Powers and the Arab-Israeli Conflict since 1947. So thank you so much, sir. And this is a really it's like a dream come true. I don't know. For me, it is like a dream come true to talk to you.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate you inviting me and being able to talk about this subject.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Thank you. So my first question to you is that why did you focus in China? Because normally academics, in the Western part of the world, they I don't want to be, again, I'll be, blocked from Twitter. They have a certain kind of paradigm in which they follow. So why did you choose China and Middle East?
Well, I mean, to be honest, so it actually started when I was based in Palestine. So as you mentioned, I was there for 2 years between 2010 and 2012. And I was working at a research center that looked at development in Palestine and on, for Palestinians. And so obviously I was looking and amongst, and it was around the time that the BRICS was becoming sort of the coming thing. And there was a lot of attention being given to the BRICS as this emerging group of countries that were going to be different to the West, maybe potentially, we weren't quite sure. And I sort of said to my colleagues, wouldn't it be interesting to explore these actors in a little bit more detail? And I came to it primarily because prior to going to Palestine, I'd done my PhD, but focusing really on Latin America. So I'm half British, but I'm also half Brazilian. So I had a particular interest, and also the week that I had arrived in Palestine was the week that Lula had just come to President Lula of Brazil back then had just visited the country. So there's a lot of interest. So I spent a bit of time, which is what my book about the emerging powers, which is really about the BRICS in the Arab-Israeli conflict and what did they do historically and what could they do differently. But as the years progressed, I increasingly found people asking me more questions specifically about China. And so this is where I started to redirect my attention a little bit. And what struck me, and I guess I started looking at it around 2015, 16. And I noticed that a lot of the community of scholars that were looking at China, and with particular reference to the Middle East, was quite small at the time. You could pretty much fit us all in a conference hall. But a lot of the focus was very much on the economic side of relations, China's relations with the region economically. And I started to think, well, what can I do that's different? And as I read, because I'm very much of a historical bent, so I started reading about the history of China in the Middle East and discovered actually that it wasn't a new actor. It wasn't solely an economic actor, that it had back in the 50s and 60s had taken a very active position when it came to politics and ideology, supporting revolutionary movements and regimes. Which seem to have been forgotten, because if you ask the average person in the Middle East about 10, 15 years ago, what do you think of China? They'd say, I'd love to know more. I mean, I think they seem to be quite nice, but we don't know very much about them. But that sort of completely negated that there was a history. And so I was very intrigued in this. And of course, because the focus was very much by other scholars on the economic side of things, what really drove me was having been in Palestine where the conflict was the central point. I wanted to expand that out to look at conflict in the region more generally. So we obviously had the Arab-Israeli conflict, but then of course there were tensions, confrontations between the Saudis and Iranians, for example. We were in a period during in the wake of the 2011 Arab uprisings. So you had the people against the regimes. And I wanted to know, where did China sit in relation to all of this? And so far as I was aware, no one had done that. So that became the focus of my book, to do a sort of a region-wide study of China, but with particular reference to conflict in the Middle East.
But that's very interesting, because when you talk about, I'll tell you the other side of the story. For example, the Adani Group of India, that has been yesterday, there's a indictment against it. And Kenya has cancelled its 30-year contract with the Adani Group for making airports. The Adani Group got a tender at the Haifa port in Israel last year. Just 4 kilometers away from it is the Haifa Bay port. It is an artificial port that has been created by China, and China is on contract over there. It is all 5G, automatic, artificial intelligence. Hardly there are 100 people in that port who work. Everything is robotic. And the pressure was specifically on Israel by US. That if you give the tender of you have given the tender of Haifa Bay port, China has taken control of it. It is doing the surveillance now. And if you give the tender of Haifa port to China, again, we'll stop doing any kind of surveillance over your nuclear submarines. So Israel had no option apart from some Gulf countries and then India. And so India took over. But it's very interesting, because the Adani Group is also facing a lot of problems from the dock workers and the lobbyists over there. So I was like, that was something which was very interesting, is like China is very, I guess, to be honest, it's ahead of us in terms of technology. And the fact that it was able to mediate certain kind of status quo between Iran and Saudi Arabia, we had longer ties with both the countries.
Hmm.
We couldn't do it. And China was able to call 14 Palestinian factions. We couldn't do it. So that is a lot. It's a question of reflection,
Hmm.
self-reflection in terms of administration. That even like a lot of Iranian scholars that I talk to, they say that the laws, the contract laws that China has are much more empowering
Mm.
at
I
a
mean,
larger state.
yeah, I mean, you were sort of talking. I mean, it is perhaps worth sort of situating some of this, what you're sort of, if I may
Yeah,
give you
yeah.
a sort of sort of some context to the discussion. So you're quite right to sort of flag up that Israel has been coming under pressure from the United States to make choices, and actually, Israel's not the only one in that respect. You see this also in the Gulf as well. In effect, what's been happening over the last, well, since the first Trump administration, we've started to see this tensions and rivalry between the United States and China starting to play out within the region. Prior to this, I think maybe we should also make a prior here that whereas when we talk about the global rivalry between the US and China, we're not talking about two peers, right? The two are not equal. I mean, the United States has a much more significant presence in the Middle East. Its economic reach and its military reach far outweigh what the Chinese have. The Chinese are catching up, but more on the economic side than the military side. And certainly for the first couple of decades after 2000, Chinese investments, trade and investments in the region were very much limited to economic activity. They did not get involved in anything political, and in some respects, they benefited from the security umbrella that the United States provided. Now, that has started to change. And in the last decade, what you have seen is that, as I've mentioned, this growing rivalry between the United States and China, with Washington putting pressure on its allies and partners to not work with Chinese firms or flagging up security risks. In the case of Israel, it was very clear we have to pull out with the Chinese because our primary partner is and ally is the United States. But you have also seen it in the Gulf. And we've seen that with the UAE firm G42, which is interested in high tech stuffs, cybersecurity issues, AI, big data. They signed a couple of contracts with various Chinese firms, and in the last few years, you've seen America, the U.S. administration and officials, making clear their concern about that. And so we have seen G42 reducing its involvement with Chinese firms and actually shifting towards signing a contract with Microsoft. So you can see, but it's interesting because I think a lot of these regimes and their associates do not want to be forced to choose between the Chinese and the Americans. They want to be able to have the best of both worlds.
Yeah.
So they have, what's happening is that they are increasingly being caught up in this political pressure, and China has its own reasons as well for wanting to exploit those or take advantage of opportunities in the region. But I think you also alluded to China as a presence when it came to the Iran-Saudi agreement, and it's true that the Chinese hosted that agreement, but they were not the main factor in getting the two of them to talk to each other. I mean, I think really, and I think scholars have been looking at this and say that actually there was a realization probably after September 2019 when the Iranian, when those drone strikes hit the Al Abqaiq
Yeah.
oil installations in Saudi
Yeah.
Arabia. There was the American response, which was Trump at the time, was to do nothing. And I think that actually made a lot of the regimes there quite fearful. If the Americans were not going to be reliable partners, then we need to start fixing our problems here in the region. And so you started to see back channel conversations initially by Oman and then subsequently Iraq to support dialogue between the Iranians and Saudis. That was already happening when the agreement was signed in Beijing. It was at the end of this very long process, which involved other actors from the region. The Chinese were really not central to this, and I think this is something that people have overlook. And so, when there's a lot of excitement about China as a power broker or a peacemaker, I think that's it's inflating things too much. I think also we're seeing this in the last year with the Gulf War. that's been happening
Yeah.
because um, soon after the outset, I mean, let's if you go back to the attacks of October 7th, the Chinese were quite striking in not condemning Hamas in the wake of what October 7th, and that actually was picked up in Israel pretty quickly. And the Israelis suddenly realized we cannot really rely on the Chinese; they're not a reliable partner. Keep in mind, this was also in a time when the Americans had been putting pressure on Israel and saying, you're either with us or the Chinese. So it was very so it wasn't the Americans were pushing at an open door there. The Chinese didn't really, I mean, at least rhetorically, they maintained the line that a two-state solution, the Oslo Accords, this that we should work towards, which they've been doing for decades. But in the wake of October 7th, they lost a lot of diplomatic goodwill from the Israelis. And so any kind of attempt by the Chinese to mediate was just met with a stonewall from the Israelis. They said, we're not interested. And there's nothing the Chinese could do about that. So this is where you start to see the Chinese shifting their focus away from Israel and the Palestinians to the Palestinians. And that's why we did see talks taking place between Hamas and Fatah, which were hosted by the Chinese. And yes, an agreement was signed, but in July, but it was only principles. I mean,
Yeah.
there's nothing substantive. There still is no national unity government, and there's nothing, and there's no indication of what the Chinese themselves are going to do to force the issue, even if they wanted to. So I think I think we need to be careful about saying that China's role in the region has changed. Maybe there are aspirations for it to become more of an active player in the region's security, but so far as I can see, it's not substantive enough yet.
No, that's actually because all of these conflicts they have the trajectory of history of so long. So the gravity along with the immediate solution, I don't believe is possible. And at the same time, there's a lot of the unity does not exist within the Palestinian factions at all. There's massive, division, fragmentation between Fatah, Hamas, between many others. And now Hamas has also, started creating its own kind of emergence in West Bank, with specifically in Birzeit University, student elections, and many others. But they are adopting a much more pragmatist line in West Bank than they did in Gaza. But at the same time, did China condemn yesterday's arrest warrants that were issued to Netanyahu by ICC and Yoav Gallant and Mohammed Deif?
I haven't seen it. I haven't seen them say anything, but also don't think the Chinese are particularly enthusiastic. As a general rule, the Chinese are not particularly enthusiastic about, sort of the intervention of such actors into domestic politics, because they're also wary of what this could mean for themselves, right? I mean, they have their own problems with Muslims, Muslim communities within Chinese borders. If we want to talk about, human rights in Xinjiang, for instance.
Yeah.
So I think so I don't think the Chinese have said anything explicit, but certainly they're not. So in that sense, they're not going to get caught in their own words as the Americans have been, because if you look at the Americans, on the one side, they've condemned these arrest warrants by the ICC against Netanyahu, and yet on the other hand, they support the arrest warrants that the ICC issued against Vladimir Putin. So
yeah, that is the hypocrisy of the time. And one thing which was very striking is that today it was suddenly, in the news that there's a sexual allegation against the ICC prosecutor Karim Khan. And I was like, yeah, the timing of it makes sense. So, and what is the safety of all these ICC judges and everyone who has made the verdict, and everything has suddenly become anti-Semitic. And this will lead to me being blocked again. But anyway, now what do you think that when we come back to China as a major economic power broker for the Gulf states specifically?
Yeah.
The Gulf states already have a lot of military bases, air bases of US. How is that disturbing their own domestic politics or their choice
I don't think it really makes an issue. It's not really an issue for the regimes. I mean, the region. So the leaderships in the region are quite comfortable with working with both the Chinese and both the Americans, right? They really, as I've said before, they really don't want to be forced to choose. But if they do, if and I suppose if they will choose, then they're going to look at what's the best. What they're going to ultimately do, what's best for themselves, not what's best for the Americans or what's best for the Chinese. And I think that's something that's often sometimes forgotten when we look at these kind of great power rivalries or sort of geopolitics. We forget that actually a lot of these actors that are squeezed between the two sides have quite a bit of agency.
Yeah.
Take for example, in the wake of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, one of the first things that Joe Biden and other Western leaders begged was for Saudis not to, to not, to ensure that the regular pumping of oil continued, but and to maybe I think it was even to increase it so that prices could come down. Whereas, as far as Riyadh was concerned, this was an opportunity to, tighten the if Western countries weren't going to be buying from Russia, that was going to limit the supply that they were going to be able to buy. That was going to thereby push prices up. And of course, for the Saudis, they have an incentive in maximizing the oil revenue that they can get because they need those resources in order to fund their economic diversification strategies. Actually, and diversification being something that all Gulf states are currently doing. And it's also worth noting that we were just talking about this before we started recording, that all 6 of those countries in the Gulf Cooperation Council are all seeking to move away from a hydrocarbon dominant economy, right? And all of them are effectively economies that are broadly similar, or at least historically broadly similar. So they are all not only are they trying to transform their economies, transform their way of doing business and their societies as a result of this, but they're also competing with each other to attract the kind of foreign investment they need in order to be able to make those changes. So there's a lot of internal rivalries, and we saw, and if you wanted to go back, there was, of course, in between 2017 and 2020 the most extreme confrontation within the Gulf, right, between the Saudis and the UAE on one side and Qatar on the other. And that seems to have been smoothed over in the last 4 years. So, and I think a lot of that was actually driven by changes by the regimes themselves, realizing that we cannot go on like this. We need to make changes. If we're going to ensure security in our region, we need to start working together. And of course, Iran's a threat, and that pulls us together. So, when we talk about America and China pushing back against each other, looking to outmaneuver the other, we mustn't forget that the Gulf states themselves have their own interests and will also look to see what advantages they can gain from that rivalry as well, right? They are not passive pawns in all of this.
No, that's interesting because the Israeli-Saudi peace, reconciliation, diplomatic recognition was supposed to happen before October 7th, and now it has been stalled. And we don't know what is the longevity of the stalling process. And now Saudi and Iran are having a lot of regular visits, diplomatic visits regularly. And even Qatar, for example, though Qatar, who has had the headquarters of Hamas for a very long time, since 1990s, after they left Jordan, it is trying to take a step back and say that, okay, we want to put pressure on both the sides. We want to have a ceasefire negotiation. If it doesn't happen, Hamas has to leave the headquarters, has to leave Qatar. So we don't know what all of this will eventually have an impact. But Saudi Arabia used the term genocide. Mohammed bin Salman recently. And that was something which was like, because how the Western media propagates the identity of Mohammed bin Salman is that he's very much dependent on US support. If US does not support Saudi Arabia even for a week, the entire royal family will collapse.
I think it's probably more internal to that. I think the position that MBS is taking probably reflects more sort of the general dissatisfaction and unhappiness within Saudi society. Certainly, Saudi Arabia was on the path to normalizing with Israel before October 7th. I mean, what we've seen over the last year, I mean, it has outraged Arab public opinion, and Saudi Arabia is no exception to that. And I think, MBS, he may be, well, pretty much all of these Gulf leaders are fairly autocratic in their approach. I mean, these are not democrats, but they do. Even if they're not democratic, they do still need to take into account public opinion
Yep.
because that their relationship with their people does require them to at least represent public opinion in some way. Otherwise, they lose legitimacy.
Yeah, and also the rentier economy model that they had.
Mm,
It's not the same. Like, for example, in Saudi, the residents have to pay for oil now. They have to
mhm.
pay for the
Yeah.
water, for electricity. It's not free
Well,
anymore.
and this is one of the big challenges, of course, with these diversification strategies, right?
Yeah,
Because in effect, what has happened is, you can, if you look at it on a number of different levels, what the Gulf is very unique in respect to shifting its economic base. So if you think about development historically, development usually has usually involved, countries. If we think about underdeveloped countries, they were usually predominantly agricultural, and as they sort of move up the supply chain. So if you think about countries that shift from agricultural to industry to high tech, and we see this in sort of classic examples of East Asia, Southeast Asia. And there's a sort of a progression, and of course, as this development process happens, you take broadly illiterate, uneducated masses who worked on the fields, and you instill human capital, education, skills, training, which enables them to work in the factories to gain the kind of skills necessary to do that, and increased wages, and it continues up the supply chain. The problem, of course, what we have in the Gulf is that, as you alluded to, it's a rentier economy. Effectively, the extraction of this oil or gas, in the case of Qatar, from the ground doesn't cost very much. It can be outsourced. You can bring in cheap labor to do that, and it actually generates very sizable incomes, which these regimes have handed over to their publics in the form of very generous welfare provision, free education, free healthcare. Now, the problem, of course, is that they recognize that this model is not going to last forever, and they have to change. The problem is, what do you do when that traditional mode of development is no longer available to you? You can't simply go through manufacturing because there are other economies. We live in a globalized world where other countries are more effective, more efficient and more effective in doing manufacturing. So you have to do. This is why they've chosen high tech, because
yeah,
as well as high tech being sort of at the apex of the development strata, it's also going to generate higher value in terms of higher wages. So you want to sort of train your society to those kind of jobs. The problem, of course, as well, is that most of the jobs that Saudis, or historically Saudis have done, or well, Halijis have done in their societies, has been in the public sector. So, which is a very comfortable government job. Increasingly, where they're being asked to, train to get new skills and to go into the private sector, and the private sector is by its nature risky. It's uncertain. Business can succeed, but it can also fail. So it's a challenge for these regimes, because they're having to change the nature of the social contract, which is that, we provide you with a job for life, generous welfare provision for life, to a much more uncertain one. Which of course is challenging, undermining the basis of their own political legitimacy and support.
yeah,
Now, this is sort of a bit of a digression, because then, of course, the question then becomes, well, what's China's role in all of this, right? And I should stress that when we say China, we always use the word China, but we really should be disaggregating it. So we're talking about the
yeah,
Chinese state firms, the Chinese. There are, of course, sizable Chinese private businesses, which are not, okay, granted. There's a little bit of a blurring with their relationship with the state, particularly in the Xi era. But there is the private firms, there's the state firms, there's the construction firms, the massive, construction firms. There's the smaller ones who are focused on just imports and exports of goods. But what's really, and in a sense, what's been happening with the Gulf states trying to pursue this form of diversification, they are looking for investments into their economy, and as well as also trying to spread their bets, spread their risks. So you're seeing sovereign wealth funds from Qatar and Abu Dhabi Investment Agency, Kuwait. These are all investing into the China, well, not just the Chinese, but globally into various stock markets in Europe, North America, and also increasingly East Asia, including China, to to ensure that there's that to hedge against what might happen in the future. What we've seen in terms of the kind of investments that Chinese firms are looking to do in the Gulf, it is different from the type of investments that they've done in other parts of the Middle East. So as I mentioned, the Gulf is really interested in high tech, high value added products and services. So you are seeing sort of Chinese firms that sort of telecommunications like Huawei, sort of as I alluded to G42 in the UAE, their partners include sort of pharmaceutical companies, health sector, real estate. They are so you're seeing a wider range of Chinese investments into the Gulf than you might see. I mean, because people often think about Belt and Road, so they think of construction.
Yeah.
Increasingly, what we're seeing is a much more diversified portfolio of Chinese investments into the Gulf. And similarly, it's two-way Gulf investments into China, although that is also facing its own challenges because of slowdown in Chinese growth, policy uncertainty as a result of the Xi government's decision to politicize or bring politics back into businesses. So there is a limit, there is a wall that they can hit. But what you're seeing has been over the last decade, very much a sort of a two-way process of economic exchange. And it's not just goods, traditional trade. It's not just hydrocarbons, oil and gas imports and exports. It's moving further beyond that to include, sort of renewable energy in the region, electric cars, big data, AI,
Yeah.
health technologies, banking, finance. It's a wide range of things that the Chinese are and the Gulf states are now involved in.
Yeah, it's as you talked about Belt and Road Initiative. So last year, on 8th or 10th of September 2023, when India was the host nation for G20, it had inaugurated the India, Middle East, Europe Economic Corridor, which was basically US, and so Biden was there, Mohammed bin Salman was there. They signed off, they gave some funds also. It was the idea of connecting Gujarat and Maharashtra to, the Middle East, like for example, to Oman, to Saudi, to Israel, and from there going to Greece and Italy. The idea that India had was the spice route that we had at around 1000 BC, which was at the same trajectory, and it was also a maritime route. IMEC is mixture of both maritime and railroads and everything. Belt and Road Initiative, interestingly, both UAE and Saudi Arabia are part of it. And they also signed for the IMEC.
Yeah, it's possible to be, and this comes back to the point I make about the agency of these Halijis, right? They're not going to be forced to choose between one or the other. They're going to cultivate both sides to see what they can get. So if a Chinese firm can offer it at a better rate than an Indian firm, they'll go with the Indian firm. As far as they're concerned, it's business, right? It's not. Yeah.
It is. And one thing which I'm coming from a point of complete ignorance. Whenever we talk about, the deep state or US or UK interfering, we talk about MI6 or CIA. What is the intelligence of China?
I mean, I'm not, to be honest with you, this is a black box, isn't it? I mean, the one thing I find, and this is one of the things that I remember talking about a decade ago when I started to do a bit more work on China and the Middle East, that in many ways, for me as a scholar, I alluded to it at the very start. I actually worked on Latin America. And so for me, I looked at Brazil and Chile. And so when I did work, I could basically knock on doors and go in and talk to people in government. And people would quite happily, not just advisors, but even ministers would tell me stuff, right, about decisions that were made. With China, it's a little bit more difficult because there's not really, where the decisions are made, we're not in those rooms, and it's very unlikely we'll ever be in those rooms. But then at the same time, you don't. It's also, and then this is also perhaps comes back to the Gulf as well, that it doesn't necessarily have to be a decision made by a particular person. It can just be, a glance or a look. I know, for example, that you mentioned that I'd worked in Dubai, and I worked on in the School of Government on public policy, and so there was we started out with these are some of the things we should be looking at, but then over the course of the year, you'd speak to someone in a position of authority, and they'd be saying, oh well, maybe we're thinking about doing this, we're not sure. You never knew where the decision came from, but suddenly something that was you were working on suddenly became not the thing to be working on, right? So it's and I think this is one of the challenges that we face. This is why I say it's important, if we can, to disaggregate China, because
Yeah.
obviously there is the Chinese state, the foreign minister, the president, but then of course we've got the diplomats, the ambassadors who are on the ground. How much influence and say do they have, as opposed to the ministry back in China? Then of course, yes, you have state firms that are doing work, but of course they are businesses as well. So they're not going to just make an investment in order to have a loss. I mean, there's got to be some kind of return for them. And when it comes to private businesses, I mean, even more so. So there is it's so then you are so to come back to the question of where you say about Chinese intelligence. Well, that's a good question, and I can't answer it because by its very nature, it's intended to be in the dark, in the shadows.
Yeah.
I think one of the things that as you, and you're probably aware that usually it's often the figures that are the least obvious that
Yeah.
are the people involved with intelligence. And so if you're thinking about at the embassy, it's not going to be the ambassador or the political secretary. It's probably the cultural attaché. But then of course there could be someone in the state firm that's is also, has a series of blurred relationships. It's what is, I think maybe what is also, but what may be of value, of interest, is that in China as well, there is sort of a burgeoning interest in the region, and you do have, Chinese researchers who are spending more time there. I mean, of course, they are university scholars as opposed to working for the state, but of course the party state blurs a bit. But of course, then you've also got, diplomats are very, polished. I mean, they do speak Arabic, often
Yeah.
much better than their Western counterparts. So that does give them a kind of an inroad into spaces that might otherwise not be available to them. But by the same token, you could also say, and this is where I think it's striking that when we talk about the relationships, we're often thinking more about the state to state relationships, because the people to people one is a bit more blurry. So for example, we were talking just before the recording about, in Dubai, there is a sizable Chinese community now, 300,000, I believe. And of this 300,000, there has been interest, at least on the Chinese side, to start using the Chinese community in Dubai as a kind of middleman or proxy for representing and promoting Chinese interests. What you've also got to understand is quite a sizable number of these Chinese nationals are not, they're not Han, they're Hui, they're Chinese Muslims, right? And so they may have an affinity to the region, but they also may have made the choice to move to the Gulf because it's more comfortable for them, given their the relative religious intolerance at home. So they can be a bit ambivalent. So for some of them, it may well be the case that they're ambivalent towards any kind of Chinese state overtures and entreaties to act as these middlemen. It's not a given that Chinese nationals are going to do this.
No, that's it's very, when I was our political attaché in the Indian embassy in Saudi Arabia right now, one of them had served before in South Korea, and then in China, and then has come to Saudi. And that is a very interesting trajectory, if you see.
Yeah. Oh no, sure. And I mean, just to give you an idea, I mean, I mean, we're talking. If you take the UK, for example, I mean, historically there has been what they used to call the Camel Corps within the Foreign Service, who are the diplomats who trained and studied Arabic, and sort of made Middle East their focus. And I mean, I have a family friend who probably came from that community. I mean, he studied Arabic. He did, he specialized in it. And it was only at the very end of his diplomatic career that he actually got sent to the to the Arab world. He worked in a whole host of other countries before then. So,
Wow. That's also like in India, the common conception also through fiction books, through
mhm,
newspapers, through media, it's very anti-China.
yeah,
But technically, because I lived in UK and I had a lot of Chinese friends
mhm,
who were 100 times much more hospitable than me.
mhm,
And there was a lot of learning that I did about their culture, very hardworking group
mhm,
of people. So
mhm,
I have a very different, understanding of them. It might be naive, it might be very, just very cursory. But at the same
mhm,
time, I believe that as we had the distinction, the state versus the people, like different.
mhm,
And also the entire idea that I was one of the only people from our diplomatic delegation who saw a bunch of Chinese in the hotel and was ready to go and speak to them. And they were
mhm,
very shocked that why is an Indian woman suddenly coming and speaking to us? And like, because I want to speak to you. So that
mhm,
is the thing. But coming back to where we started from, I
yeah,
was in Palestine in 2016, 17.
mhm.
I don't remember in Ramallah. It can be my memory is fading me. Um, I did not see or hear about any Chinese embassy. Is there a Chinese embassy in Ramallah?
Not in Ramallah. Well, actually, almost none of the I would say that most of the states do not have representation in Ramallah. I mean, there are a few that have an office. I don't think they don't elevate it to the status of an embassy. And you often find sort of overlap, or sort of one diplomat in for a country, sort of speaking, representing both sides. Certainly, I mean, I found this to be the case. So, I mean, when I was working on my book about the rising powers, the BRICS in Israel and Palestine, I was interviewing the Brazilians who had their embassy down in Tel Aviv, but from time to time they would do an occasional visit to Ramallah where they would speak to and represent Brazilian Palestinian citizens there. So
Ah,
they would do that kind of outreach.
okay. They
Yeah.
had
No,
the permit, diplomatic
yeah.
permit to
Well,
travel. Yeah.
yeah. Yes. I mean, but the thing, I mean, I suppose if you're talking about, so in terms of the Chinese, the Chinese when it comes to the Israel and the Palestinians, it's important to keep in mind that historically the Chinese, were very sympathetic towards Palestinian aspirations back in the 1950s and 60s, and very supportive of the Palestinians, particularly in the wake of the 1967 war, where if the Arab position was very much synonymous with the communists, with the Soviets and the Chinese, and Israel with the Americans. And indeed, at that time, this was the sort of the most radical period of Chinese history during the Cultural Revolution. They were actually providing not a lot, but a bit of material support to the PLO in their cross-border clashes with Israel. That changes from the 1970s onwards. It becomes much more diplomatic focus, and I think there's also a realization that the PLO is not going to throw out the Israelis. So, what you see is a change, and in fact, actually, from the late 1970s and through the 1980s, you actually have this clandestine relationship between the Chinese and Israelis, which is based primarily on the arms trade.
Yeah.
So, effectively, what was happening was the Chinese, especially in the wake of their war with Vietnam, had lost a lot of materiel. And a lot of that material was like tanks and equipment, which was Soviet in character. Now, they weren't going to buy it from Moscow,
Yeah.
but they managed to find a very useful source in Israel, because in
Yeah.
the wake of the 67 war and the 73 war, there was a lot of tanks and equipment left on the battlefield, the Egyptians and Syrians, who had bought it from the Soviets. So the Israelis effectively sold this to the Chinese, and that was the start of the relationship between China and Israel. So they established diplomatic relations in 1992, and this arms
Yeah.
trade kind of continues and continues into a more economic dimension to the point where really, even though the Chinese, and they always historically maintained this commitment to Oslo, yes, diplomatically, rhetorically they did, but in practical terms, the relationship with Israel became far more important economically. The Palestinians could not offer the same kind of economic opportunity in exchange. And that was pretty much the situation until last year, when effect, or the last few years really, because once the Israelis started to face pressure from the Americans from about 2018, 2019, you start to see the level of trade and the level of investments from China and Israel fall. That's also worth noting, actually, in the wider Middle East as well. There's a sort of a dip. There's a dip after 2018 in terms of Chinese investments into the region, and there's a number of reasons for that. It's not just unique to Israel. It's happening not only in the region but globally. This actually predates the pandemic, and there's a number of arguments put forward here, which is that until that point, a lot of these projects, or a lot of the investments were sort of those kind of big ticket things like construction, ports, roads, railways. Um, you know, these were also financed by large loans from policy banks,
Yes.
Chinese policy banks. And as you're probably aware, back in around 2018, 2019, we started to see countries, not in the Middle East, but places like Sri Lanka and
Yes.
elsewhere, who suddenly found themselves facing a debt crisis. And suddenly these loans did not seem like such a clever idea to the Chinese anymore. So you start to see them pull back, not trying to sort of capture these countries in a debt crisis, but more sort of trying to make good their losses or to limit the risk of this. And so you start to see a change in sort of decision making happening, and this affects the region as a whole. But I come back to the point about the Gulf, which is that the Gulf is qualitatively different to the rest of the Middle East. If you take, I mean, I think the classic example would probably be, the Saudis on one side and the Egyptians on the other. Egypt is the largest Arab population, but it is predominantly a developing country. It is industrializing. So it makes sense to have those kind of Belt and Road projects of a port or roads or railways. That makes much more sense in a place like Egypt. You don't really need to do that in Saudi Arabia because they've got a lot of that already in place.
Yeah.
What they want is more high tech, high value,
Yeah.
economic opportunities and exchange and services. So you're seeing different kinds of investments there as opposed to, say, somewhere in Egypt.
Yeah, like I was, as an Indian, what I can tell you is that having been to both Egypt and Saudi Arabia, Egypt, when I went specifically Cairo, apart from the
Mhm,
Belgian British architecture, there were, and the areas near Tahrir Square.
mhm,
For a very long time, it felt as if I'm still in India.
mhm,
For me in Egypt, in Cairo. Not the same for
mhm,
Alexandria. Alexandria had a much more European feel to it. But
mhm,
Cairo, some quarters of Cairo felt completely like I'm in India. I'm not outside.
mhm,
No, this is India. Because of the crowd, the noise, the population, the language, the way we talk, the bargain, and all of it. In
mhm,
Saudi Arabia, it suddenly felt that I have come to a very, very empowered golden cage.
mhm,
In terms of the amount of development, the amount of architecture, the planning of the city,
mhm, mhm.
and the kind of you hardly see anyone on the road.
No, sure. And I would say, I mean, if my memory is, if I recall in Dubai, for instance, the same sort of
Yeah,
thing. You have a very sort of, it's a very middle class existence in these bubble type shopping malls. And yeah, down by the canal, you have that
yeah,
the old souk, which
yeah.
is, I think, but I would say that souk to me feels a little bit artificial. It feels a little bit, you know, it maybe historically it was a place that real commerce would happen. Now it just feels a little bit like sort of almost like a living museum rather than,
Oh, Yeah, I think the better way than the Golden Cage is a living museum, to put it.
Mhm.
Yes, I felt that. I don't know if Jeddah would be different, but
Mhm.
then I can't go to Mecca, Medina until and unless I
Yeah.
convert. So I don't know about Jeddah, but it's also, I would like to go there to see because there are much more of diaspora, Indian diaspora in
Mhm.
Jeddah than Riyadh. Um,
Yeah.
and at the same time, when it came to Egypt, there was in Cairo, there was much more of like Shah Rukh Khan, Salman Khan, the kind of familiarity with Indian Bollywood or soft power was even
Mhm.
much more palpable, and that was something which was
Yeah.
very different. The same goes in Palestine also. Like, okay, Shah Rukh Khan, come, let's have free tea. So that was
Uh,
something. Soft power of Bollywood was very important.
yes, and
China
I
has
think when
not
you're
been able
talking,
to do that.
well, this is something that's is and it does. I mean, admittedly, there may be some more recent stuff here that I've overlooked, but in terms of soft power, Chinese soft power in the Gulf, um, you do have, I guess, for the state at least, the medium to be used would be the Confucius Institutes, because
Yeah.
I mean, yes, we talked a little bit about the diaspora, the Chinese diaspora in Dubai, which is the most sizable, and there is a presence, but in terms of sort of the state actually being able to try and influence through a soft power dynamic, probably the Confucius Institutes probably be the most relevant or appropriate. The difficulty you find with those is the in many ways the kind of the relationships that I mean they're there to encourage and encourage Chinese language instruction and sort of awareness of Chinese culture, um, but in many ways the sort of the general feeling that's come out of some of the research that's been done on these institutes is that from a social level, the feeling is that they are primarily that the people who make use of them, the people that sign up to Chinese language courses, are doing so in a very transactional way. It's not about their absolute. Then it's not necessarily instilling a love of China into them, but more about okay, China is now a presence in this region. They present Chinese companies present opportunities for business. So maybe it makes sense for me to learn the Chinese language to be able to you know
Yeah.
get a job with them or to be able to do business with them. And that probably is the limit of Chinese soft power. And this is why I think it's also a lot of the scholarly literature really still focuses primarily on this high level, state to state relations, which I think doesn't really necessarily penetrate or put in roots at societal level.
Yeah.
Certainly, you do see certainly you have seen in these partnership agreements that China has signed with all the individual countries in the Gulf and the wider Middle East. There is, always in these agreements, sort of partnerships about how they want to do collaborate, at state level, but also at the social level to encourage more people to people exchange. At the moment, as so far as I can tell, much of this is really geared around education. So sort of, grant,
Yeah.
whether if it's not the Confucius Institutes and language instruction, it's also, exchange programs between Saudi and Chinese students, for example,
Yeah.
Saudis being able to go to Chinese universities. I think the numbers are still relatively low on that, relative to where Gulf citizens would have typically gone. So I'm thinking about North America, Europe, and there may well partly be a language barrier, a language issue here, because I mean, you're more likely to have learned English, I suppose, as at school, which then makes you more inclined to maybe go to a British university or an American university as opposed to a Chinese one, unless you have studied Chinese. It's going to be difficult otherwise.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I think in terms of sort of the reach of China into the Gulf, I don't think it's as deep or as substantive as arguably the Indian diaspora, which we talked about before recording. There is such a historical presence of South Asians in the Gulf, and there and well both it's so long standing there that I think it has created its own kind of culture and dynamic, which I don't think necessarily might be the case when it comes to the Chinese. But I could
Yeah.
be maybe some of your listeners know better, so maybe they can comment.
Yeah. I don't know. It's we are so many of us that we
Mhm.
have to export us everywhere. So that is the
Mhm.
point, and that makes more sense to like export, go everywhere, go everywhere. It's like that,
Mhm.
and the Chinese themselves are most of the universities in UK. They are actually running specifically because they have a lot of Chinese students.
Mhm. Although that's changing now. I mean, that may well change because of the changes being made on migration, on immigration
Oh
policy, and
yes,
so
yes,
we may well start to see fewer numbers being granted visas or being willing to take up a place, maybe because of the costs, which will go up as well. This is also something to
yes.
do with with Indians as well, because you're probably familiar that this is the thing that sort of keeps breaking down when it comes to the UK India trade agreements. The Indians want to talk about migration and the British don't. So.
Yes, kind of. Like, I was the last year, which because the student visa had 1 year of student visa for MA, plus
Mhm.
1.5 years to stay there further. You need to fund
Mhm.
it, but to stay there further
Well,
and look for a job.
it
And
used
they
to, it
stopped
was very
it.
much the case. Yes, I mean, it was very much the case about 20, 30 years ago when I first went to university, and I met a lot of South Asians, from the region, who studied with me, and they had I think it was their visa situation was that they were entitled to a year after they
Yeah,
graduated to be able to find work. More recently they cut that back to about 6 months, and now I think they're talking about removing it entirely to the
yeah,
point. Whereas I think, I mean, but this change has already been coming in for a while. So I think it was back in 2013. I was in Bangalore, and I remember being meeting a lot of young Indians who were sort of at age. They were around 17, 18, and a lot of them said to me, my older brother and my older sister went to university in England, but the way things are going now, it's not attractive for me anymore. So if I can't stay to work, then there's no reason. So.
yeah. It makes sense. It makes sense actually. And but most of the countries after the pandemic are adopting the economic protectionism
Mhm.
kind of policy in
Yeah.
migration. Let's see what Donald Trump does.
Mhm.
We are very happy, we, not me,
Yes.
but we are very happy in the sense that, Donald Trump has come back to office and
Mhm.
on 20th of January, he's coming back. But what is he actually going to do with the trade regulations with India? He
Yes.
has
And
often
that's
called,
actually and that's and
yeah,
that's something to think about. And that obviously presents its own challenges in the Gulf because um, certainly, the last time that Trump came in, when he first came in, he was an unknown quantity. We now know what you're getting with him. With the At the time that he came in 2016, 17, many of the Gulf leaders were quite supportive of Trump, and they liked the idea of Trump because they also saw him being quite strong and robust when it came to Iran pulling out of the nuclear deal. But the problem was he didn't put anything in its place. And so Iran became more of an unstable figure, factor for Gulf Arab states. And as I've then also we've mentioned as well, the Trump's decision not to act after the Al Abqaiq drone attack really sent jitters amongst Gulf leaders to say that really maybe we need to start doing something ourselves to solve this problem because we can't rely on the Americans. So now with Trump coming back, there does seem to be a sense in amongst Gulf leaders, not necessarily that they're totally supportive of him, but they know that he's unreliable. And I think most most governments are recognize this. But in the Gulf, there is a sense of unreliability coming in again. And so, they will take advantage of that where they can. But
yeah,
at the same time, it also means that they do have to look for ways to solve some of the problems that they're facing, or at least find ways to work around that. So this is where I think you've seen a bit of a détente. Well, obviously, I think the Saudi-Iranian détente will continue because it's in both their interests for that to
yeah,
happen. Um, that said, of course, if Trump does decide to become more aggressive towards Iran, that's going to pose awkward questions in the Gulf. I think the question is then going to become, well, what's your alternative? What are you suggesting then? If you're going to at the same time, what we're also seeing the sort of the well, the protectionist barriers that were put in place with China will have consequences for the Gulf as well.
yeah,
We've already started to we've been seeing this actually over the last few years that um, businesses, if especially if there are companies that are sanctioned in China, you're going to try and see these companies in the Gulf make avoiding doing work with them. So we've seen this with G42, having pulled out some of its business with Chinese firms that it's worried about, being on the wrong end of the American administration, and that's been so in many respects. The Biden presidency didn't really change a lot of things when it came to the Gulf. It kind of continued a lot of the things that had started under Trump, and now we're going back to Trump. I think we'll still continue to see, Gulf states trying to see what they can do to navigate this path between the US on one side and China on the other. At the same time, it's important to see that the Chinese are not, sitting, they're not sitting in isolation from all of this. They have their own interests as well, and they have their own motivations. And increasingly, what we've seen the Chinese trying to do, and this is where I think maybe their position on Israel after October 7th stands out, because I think it makes sense to look at the Chinese in the Gulf and in the Middle East, through several different lenses or different perspectives. So, of course, China typically, it's the Beijing deals with individual states, one to one. So with this, it will deal with the Saudis, it will deal with the Iranians, and it will do that in isolation. But of course, it can't do that solely in isolation, because of course these countries have their own rivalries and tensions between them. So it has to have a regional perspective as well. And this is why maybe something like the Iran-Saudi agreement brokered by the Chinese makes sense. But then on top of that, you've also got the global perspective, which is its rivalry with the United States. And so what China's trying to do, it will, in its relationship with each individual Gulf state, it will also keep an eye to what does this mean for the with my rivalry with the United States. Yeah. So if I can, and this is led to some scholars, Jonathan Fulton, who's based out at Abu Zaid University, and he's coined quite a nice term on all of this, because he said effectively what you had, and most of us were talking about this as scholars, we said that China's relationship to the region was effectively a hedging one. So it wasn't balancing against the United States. It wasn't bandwagoning with the United States. What it was doing was putting lots of little different chips, on the table to, hedge against any kind of risk of one falling over the other. And that was kind of the standard position that most scholars took. Now, Fulton is saying, what we're now seeing is a shift, because that was a hedge. That was a kind of trying to avoid risk as much as possible. But now what we're starting to see is the Chinese actually trying to exploit the differences that are emerging when US action and policy becomes a problem. So what he calls wedging. So hedging to wedging. So in this sense, what happens is that when the Americans put pressure on their allies and partners to not do business with the Chinese, well, like I said, agency matters. If a Gulf state says, fine, okay, we won't work in that particular field, but what can we do to maximize our return on all of this? The Chinese look at this and go, well, okay, look, you're being the victim of all of this American pressure. Yeah. Why don't you support our efforts to try and counter this? And so what you're seeing, for example, is in the last few years, a great desire by China and others in BRICS to de-dollarize the global economy. So you're starting to see efforts to reduce because of course most trade is done in dollars, right? So this means you're kind of tied somewhat to American policy, whether you like it or not, because of American monetary policy. So if you can start to do more trade in your own currency, and there is motivation in Beijing to use the yuan as for economic exchange, then that kind of cuts out the Americans. And so this idea of reforming the global financial order to be less dollar dependent is something that the Chinese are really keen on, and they can sort of point to their partners in the region and say, look, why don't you come along with us on this? And so you're increasing. So for example, with the Saudis, you're starting to see more trade happening between Saudi Arabia and China that uses the rial and the yuan as opposed to dollars. And that's something that it serves China's purpose in a number of different ways. On one hand, it enables it to cultivate closer relations with them, and also to say, look, we can have a different kind of world order here that doesn't involve the Americans telling you what to do.
Yeah.
So um, so the Chinese are not passive actors in all of this at all. They have their own agenda in the Middle East and in the Gulf, and so they will be trying to exploit whatever opportunities are present there. And I'm sure we'll probably see something from the Chinese along the lines of, well, we kind of have seen this with the ICC arrest warrant out for Netanyahu. On the one hand, you have the Americans saying this is terrible, but on the other hand, we support the ICC warrant against Vladimir Putin. The Chinese will basically turn around and say, well, look, I'm sure this is just American hypocrisy and double standards, and at least look at us, how consistent we are when it comes to Israel and Palestine.
Yeah, no, that is, like completely. I remember there was one television debate where there was a Chinese scholar, a Russian scholar, Israeli scholars who called it Judea and Samaria. I a couple of Indian scholars, and the Chinese and the Russian were completely against, very verbally against Israel on the TV. I didn't have that space to be so critical, but Chinese and the Russian were completely there. And coming to your question of, the interesting thing that you said, that Israel and China established diplomatic bonds in 92. India and Israel also established diplomatic bonds in 92. They had the Trade and Economic Center in 1952-53 in Mumbai. The Israeli foreign minister, and there were so many who were coming during Nehru's time to have Israel's diplomatic maneuvers in India. They halted it. They said, okay, have a trade and economic center in 1952-53 in Mumbai. Mumbai is so far off, it's okay. But after the first Gulf War, the division within the Arab states getting, abandoning the Palestinian cause, as you said, Israel working on the upgradation of Soviet weapons. There were so many things that propelled India to actually then start having the diplomatic ambassador level dialogue with Israel in 92. And we established, or we recognized, the Palestinian state in 1988. So that is something which is, very interesting. It's like there's a lot to be,
Yes, I mean, so as you're quite right. So formal diplomatic relations were established in 92, but of course there was this kind of informal exchange that went on between India and Israel prior to that point. Of course, keep in mind as well that during the 60s and 70s, Indian policy was very pro-Palestinian, very explicit. There was obviously sort of parallels drawn between the colonialism that the Palestinians faced from Israel to the colonialism that India had faced from Britain. And so there was very much, and also I think there was also a strong anti-Israel position, also a pro-Arab position, because I think in many ways, and let's be cynical about this as well, part of the reason for the successive Congress government support for the Palestinians was to get broader Arab support for its claims over Kashmir. Arab, sort of get Muslim support over Kashmir. There was, and I'm always struck by this because this came when I was doing the research for the book on rising powers and the Arab-Israeli conflict, that the shift starts to happen after around 1970, when you start to see Arab states like Egypt willing to make peace with Israel, eventually through Camp David. And there's a point in which in New Delhi, some of the diplomatic and political heads start to ask the question, why is it that we are taking a more pro-Arab position than some of these Arab states are taking in their own region? So we're being more pro-Palestinian than some of the Arab countries. That doesn't make sense to us. So you start to see a shift happening sort of from the late 70s into the 80s. Not saying which and of course these meetings that do take place between, I think between Gandhi, isn't it? And the Israeli leadership prior to
Yeah,
92. So there's
yeah,
already that shit. There's already sort of a pulling back from the pro-Palestinian position at the official level. What you do have as well after 1992, but it becomes more so in the decade afterwards, that actually the exchange that happens between Israel and India is very much well based around the arms trade. So just as I was saying, the 1980s, Chinese Israel economic exchange was very much focused on arms. That continues until the Americans basically say in around 2000, we're a bit uncomfortable with you, Israel, selling weapons to the Chinese, because particularly, when it comes to things to do with Taiwan. So that's when the Israelis pull out and they find an alternative market in India. And
yeah.
so we see a sizable, I mean, so if you look at the BRICS, the five countries or the original five countries of the BRICS, when it comes to sort of in Israel's arms transfers, India is the predominant one.
Oh, yes, we are. And, by 1970s, actually, it started because in 1971, Bangladesh was
Mm,
created. And then the question that came in the parliamentary debates after in 1970s was that we keep talking about 8 million Palestinians and refugees. Why are the Arabs not talking about the Indian partition? Why are they not talking about Indian refugees?
mm,
Why are they not talking about the India, like the Bangladesh formation and independence? Israel recognizes Bangladesh in 1972.
mm,
The Arab countries recognized Bangladesh in 1974.
mm,
So that was the beginning. It was just like the beginning of, even during the time of Nehru, Gandhi had a lot of Jewish friends. There's very few archival evidence on Palestinian leaders who came to India in 1930s. And
mm,
Gandhi had strong like soulmates who were his friends in South Africa who were Jewish. But the point again, like we are the biggest, highest importer of Israeli arms.
mm,
And we have started also exporting surveillance drones of around 2.9 million to Israel.
mm. Yeah.
And it's not at the same level, but I think the India, Middle East, Europe economic corridor was a much more subtle way of placing Israel in the business connections with the Gulf, with the, like the
Well,
diplomatic
I mean,
maneuvering.
so of course, there is the sort of the mini quartet, right? Where, so if you think about the Indo-Pacific, that kind of framing, that language that has been used to sort of reframe Asia Pacific
Yeah,
relations. And of course, you've got the quartet of, is it India, the US, Japan, and Australia, right?
yeah,
Which is
yeah,
very much, which is, it's become increasingly geared to containing or at least sort of being directed against China. You then
yeah,
had, in recent years, you've had this kind of mini quartet emerging in the Middle East with Israel, the UAE, and then India and the United States.
yeah,
And
I
it's
agree.
interesting that when you look at the aims and objectives of sort of the principles in all of this, certainly from the American and the Israeli perspective, sorry, the American and the Indian perspective, there is a sense of, wouldn't this be great to use this as a kind of Middle East regional way of containing China, right? But
That
if you then
is
look at,
this,
but
that
then
is,
when you look at, but then when you look at the principles, the leaders of Israel and the UAE. Granted, this was pre-October the 7th, but but for the leaderships of Israel and the UAE, they were not enthusiastic about turning the mini quad, as they call it, into sort of an anti-China project. India
yeah,
and the US, yes, but
yeah.
not, at least not until recently, at least not until October the 7th, were the Emiratis and Israel on board with that idea.
Yeah,
So,
that is the beauty of diplomacy because that is one word which I just don't understand what it means. Because it can
mm,
mean the Quad, J, I2U2, IMEC, all of this. Like Quad is going to have a meeting in June, July next year. Trump
mm,
is going to come to office by January. So Trump might come to India next year because India is hosting the Quad meeting.
mm,
Now, interestingly, there's so much of, like even J, for example, with Australia, Japan, and India. There's so many regional alliances that are being made, but it's what exactly do they mean in the longer period of
mm,
time? What is the
Mhm.
longevity of it? So all these questions are very diplomatic to finances of, because you never know, what the reality is going on behind the scenes.
Mhm.
And with the status quo now changing,
Mhm.
with Middle East, what we did was, like, as European Union and others put a lot of sanctions on Russia. Russia started sending its oil to India. India started refining it and exporting it as a laundry state, and that was helping our political economy.
Mhm.
So
Yeah.
that kind of relation is
Yeah,
also very
and that's
strong.
actually something because you asked you sort of before, you sent me in the email, so you were asking me about sort of China's interests with the Gulf and whether it's dependent at all on sort of oil and gas from that region. And actually, in some ways, there's a kind of a mutual interdependence here because yes, as China is now the largest importer of oil and gas. In fact, actually, you know, China's relationship to the Gulf really changes after 1993 because that's the year that it ceases to be an oil producer and becomes a net importer of oil, and that's where you're going to get much of that oil from the Gulf, and so therefore you need to have regular supply and trade of that. And so this is also another reason for the Chinese being interested in relative stability in the region. They don't want instability is the worst thing possible for the regular flow and supply of oil. Um, so you do see there is, and increasingly as China has become more and more thirsty for domestic reasons, it has had to look for where it can get regular supplies. Now, in terms of the Gulf, Saudi Arabia, Iran, the UAE, Oman, these are all, and Iraq as well, actually, are all important suppliers to China. But the largest supplier of oil to China is actually Russia.
Yeah,
And one of the things about China's oil dependence is that although it is reliant on regular supplies from the Gulf, it has also tried to address the vulnerabilities of that trade, and so it has tried to diversify its oil imports from other parts of the world, so as to counter some of the risks of one country failing or the other. In the case of Iran, it's also done a pretty good deal. Just as you were saying that India has managed to get sort of cheaper oil from Russia, China has done the same thing with Iran because, of course, with the
yeah,
American maximum pressure policy after pulling out of the nuclear deal, the Iranians had no one to sell it to. And so what ended up happening was that they started selling it to the Chinese through third parties. The Chinese don't formally or officially admit to it being purchases from Iran, but the crude oil would be bought by a third party, shipped through somewhere like Malaysia and ends up in refineries on China's coast, which are not doing business with companies abroad, so they're not going to be sanctioned, and so that's where the refining takes place. Obviously, China was getting this at a very discounted price, which is good for it, but not so great for Tehran. And you're starting to see some resentment and frustration amongst Iranian policy decision makers about, sort of maybe them selling it at too cheap an amount. Um, but also on the Gulf side, the Arab Gulf side, so Iran really does need China to
yeah,
buy its oil. Similarly, Gulf states like the Saudis and the UAE to a lesser extent, but Kuwait and Oman, they also need China to continue buying their oil because, as I've said before, their diversification strategies are contingent on you know maximizing as much oil revenue as possible to finance these things, also
yeah.
to finance the sovereign wealth funds that are going to invest in other projects. So there is this sort of tension. There is this tension at work in the Gulf that diversification does require them to still be for China to still be a big customer to them. But the problem is, of course, China's a customer and a thing that they are trying to get hooked off, if you will. So
No, that's. But one thing which I've noticed, that China has more academic dialogues with
mm,
Iranians or with the academics in the Gulf than we do.
mhm.
At more conference levels, more academic exchanges. That is something that we have to also follow on. And the Iranian scholars are also, they're very openly pro, like when it comes, because when they talk to me, it's morely like India, China kind of. So they are more protective of China's policy in Iran. But with this, I would none of the questions for everyone. There was a list of questions that I gave, sir. None of the questions was how we conducted the podcast today. And at the same time, there's one thing that I would like to mention to all of you, that at a personal level, what I've seen very different in our speaker for today is that he doesn't have a transactional mindset when it comes to um, spreading knowledge, be it about writing articles, research papers, or giving a podcast or a talk in which he might not get anything in return, you know. And it might just be for empowering people he'll never meet in his life. I have seen that kind of instinct in him for all the years that I have been in touch with him. And to be honest, it has been really, with your posts, sometimes I feel very like we are in the same boat kind of situation. And sometimes I feel that, okay, these are so many things that you have to achieve further in life. So thank you for being that kind of role model. And
No,
thank you for, like giving us the privilege of your time. And I would upload the recording today.
no, well, no, thank you for having me. And I hope it was of interest to students who are, well, people listening in on learning a little bit more about what China's doing in the Gulf and the Middle East more generally. So it's one of those things where I think we're in a period of flux at the moment. So there's a
Yeah.
lot of things going on right now that, also a lot of the, I mean, I would even say some of the, so, I've been doing this, looking at this now for about a decade, slightly more. And yet I think right now we're kind of in a place where some of the things that we had taken as almost writ when it comes to China and the Middle East are now being challenged. So this is
Yeah.
one of the exciting things about this particular field. It doesn't stand still. So
It doesn't. It's always changing, and especially after January
mm,
20th, we are
mm,
going to have political earthquakes day after day.
yeah.
So you never know what happens. Yesterday was a massively, like difficult day to consume through news because there's so many things happening at the same time.
Mhm.
But that is, once again, it was a privilege for me to talk with an expert on China Middle East relations, even though I have very cursory knowledge on it, to be honest. So, and thank you for answering all the questions in detail, sir.
Very
And
welcome.
thank you so much for the privilege of your time. It's very, and
Yeah.
if you come to India again, do let us know.
I will try. I will try. And thank you. And have a good rest of the afternoon and evening for you guys.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay.
Bye.
Take care. Bye.